the Exodus for another 10 months until Passover again. But to remind everybody, the Israelites fled Egypt. They have now their backs against the sea. The Egyptian army is coming, and it seems like they're in a no-win situation, right? What do? Do you throw yourself into the sea? Do you attempt to somehow fight with this Egyptian empire? Do you give up and let yourself go back into servitude? And so in classic Talmudic form, of course, the Jewish community with this enemy encroaching and their backs against the sea could not agree on what the right tactic is, right? Who could imagine? And so the Talmud says that immediately 4 different camps arose within the Israelite encampment, and Moses was sitting in the middle of the encampment, and 4 groups all go and tell Moses what the Israelites should do. And the Talmud reads as follows. One group says, we should just give up. Let us jump into the sea. The entire Exodus was for nothing. Yet a second group said, we should return to Egypt. The servitude in Egypt is better than us risking our lives out here in the desert by the sea with the encroaching Egyptian empire. A third group said, no, let's take up arms. We have to fight this. We're not going to give up. We're not going to just go back to Egypt. Let's go to war. And a fourth group said, we should just sit back and pray to God and hope that God handles it. And so these 4 groups go to Moses, and you can imagine, the robust debates that were happening in the community. And the Talmud ends by Moses saying, I talked to God, and God said, these are all incomplete answers, right? There's some mixture of all of these that has a little bit of a virtue of being correct. But at the end of the day, what God tells you is just keep on moving forward. And I think this is a really relevant piece of Torah here because, and I'll get more into the specifics on campus, but we really are at a crossroads right now of not just Jewish life on campus, but Jewish life globally. We're at a crossroads in terms of Israel. We're at a crossroads in terms of Jews anywhere in the Western world, especially on campus. And we are dealing with a community that rightfully so is rife with a multiplicity of both opinions and ways that they think the situation should be approached. And there's a lot of truth and a lot of different tactics. And one of the things that I've done over the last couple of months, and again, I'll give some specifics when I actually start, is talking with different student groups, different groups of Jewish professors, and different groups with school administrators, all hearing out different strategies and what makes the most sense in which scenario. And I'll talk to one group of students who wants to have a very active approach and maybe, very proactive, and let's go and try to fight this on campus in some way. There are other groups that want to sit back and let the administration handle it. There are other groups who are almost, giving up and saying, well, Jews should just leave the university en masse and maybe just go to Brandeis or just go to Yeshiva University. And none of these groups, I'm going to argue, are complete in and of themselves. And I think that there is a value to understanding that there are a lot of different approaches. So that's just a little bit of background. The 4 points that I want to get across is something that I've been thinking about for a while. And as in the introduction, just a little bit of background, I've been lucky enough to basically be living on a college campus for the past 13 years between being an undergrad, graduate school, and now a rabbi/adjunct professor at UCI. And I've really seen universities shift and change and morph and evolve in ways that are scary. But I've also seen through my journey as a rabbi working with college students, I actually have seen a lot of things to be optimistic about. And so I'm going to end with optimism. But before we get to the optimism, we have to go through the difficult situation we're in. So the first point that I want to highlight is liberalism, the idea of capital L liberalism, not lowercase political party, but capital L liberalism of we value freedom of speech, we value freedom of expression, we treat each other as individuals and not as a part of a group. There's freedom of religion, freedom from religion. There's generally a sense in society that we want a meritocracy. That idea is under attack in very scary ways, both from the left and also from the right. On the right, it's a lot less evident on campus. If this was a discussion about general political upheaval and Jews in America, I would spend probably half this time talking about the illiberalism of the right. On campus, it's almost all coming from the left. And just to highlight a little bit of the history here, one of the things that I actually teach about on campus is this past year I was teaching a course of American Jewish history. And one of the things in American Jewish history that's really interesting is, especially with the university system, in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s, universities across America went down an extremely anti-Semitic rabbit hole. Columbia University famously capped a quota for how many Jews they were going to take. They actually opened up another college in New York City down the street from Columbia. Now it's known as City College. And the origins of City College was quite literally just to push the Jews who wouldn't fit in with the, good men at Columbia, right? It was all men back then. The good men at Columbia, they go to City College. Other schools such as Brown University actually made it illegal for there to be a kosher dining plan on campus because they thought that that would help reduce the number of Jewish students. And so campus life for Jews has not always been this, panacea or Gan Eden-like situation. But one of the things that happened in American Jewish life, and one of the things that also is scary now, is from the late 40s until, if anyone wants to guess when we benchmark that, Jews in America were going through a golden age by all accounts. The last 2 generations of life in America for Jews has been absolutely unprecedented of anything else Jews have faced in the diaspora over the last 2,000 years. This is something that's sort of beyond debate, beyond discussion. And a lot of people here, I think, intuitively feel it. I mean, I think everybody here is lucky enough, and I myself is included, to be born and raised in an America where our Jewish identities were not only not a negative, but in a lot of ways they were a positive, right? There's great Jewish infrastructure. There's a lot of incredible Jewish resources, right? We have incredible synagogues. We have incredible JCCs, incredible youth programs. And these were really built between 1 and 2 generations ago during the beginning of this golden age, where in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there was an outpouring of both internal Jewish philanthropy into Jewish institutions, but also the general public viewed Jews as just a part of the wider American experiment. The idea of Judeo-Christian tradition, where now it's associated a lot with generally conservative politics, that actually emerged in the 1950s by both liberal Jewish leaders and liberal Christian leaders as a way to prove the point in America that Jews are just as much Americans as Christians, which again, for people who are familiar with Jewish history in the West, is quite a radical thing to have happened. And so by all accounts, we are living, or we have been living, in the middle of a golden age where it's been accepted in America, and especially accepted at a university, that ideas that a lot of us take for granted, such as freedom of speech, let everybody talk and the best ideas rise to the top, meritocracy, the idea that if we're hiring for a job, or the idea that if we're admitting students into college, we try to get the best ones, individualism, the idea that I don't see you as whatever your gender is or whatever your race is, but I see you as an individual that's not connected to some wider group that I'm going to stereotype you a part of. That was the norm. But in a lot of ways, that is changing in very quick ways. And the first thing that I want to argue is that is changing oftentimes as a result of what's happening top down at the university. I think the writing was on the wall for people who are paying attention in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But in the last couple of years, we've seen, especially in the social sciences and the humanities, an entire overthrow of capital L liberalism and replaced by, we can call it a type of illiberalism, right? Regressivism, right? Some people maybe on the right call it cultural Marxism. Other people can call it, right, a postmodernist framework, anti-colonialist framework. There's a lot of different buzzwords that people throw around. Sometimes it's hyperbolic, sometimes it's not. But there really is a sentiment now on campus that it actually is not about freedom of speech and meritocracy. And even on the academic level, and this will just round up the first point that I want to make, even on the academic level, professors no longer see their jobs as objective arbiters of a capital T truth. They are starting to see their jobs as activists. And activism is oftentimes incompatible with truth seeking. If I want to be an activist for something, that is in contradistinction to if I want to present you a well-rounded opinion. And that used to be taken for granted. And it used to be considered extremely taboo for a professor to even hint who they were going to vote for in an election, right? I was reading old bylaws from history departments because I was just interested in the history of politicization at the university. And in the 1970s and 80s, there were all these insider memos from all these, more progressive type departments, right? Feminist studies, women's studies, now it's called gender studies, history, social sciences, that basically said it's against university policy for professors to say who they're voting for. Nowadays, it's almost strange if you have a professor and their office is not full of politicized posters, if they don't have a Twitter full of politics. And so what's happened is the university has ceded ground to a type of activism. Sometimes we like the activism, sometimes we don't. But the university has ceded ground to activism that long-term is both not good for the university and higher education, but it's also not good for Jews and Jewish students, because the flip side of this argument is that liberalism has been very good for the Jews. And just, I'm going to completely butcher 2,000 years of Jewish history. I teach Jewish history, so I can go into a 10-week course on any sentence I'm about to say. For the last 2,000 years, Jews were not treated liberally, capital L, meaning there was never a time before America that Jews in the diaspora were treated as individuals and not as a part of, you're just Jewish. This doesn't mean that life was always terrible for Jews in the diaspora. There were times, right, such as 11th century Spain or 16th century Poland or 17th century Netherlands/Amsterdam, that Jews had pretty good lives in the diaspora. So we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that the last 2,000 years were just, one pogrom after another. But Jews were never treated as equals. In the Islamic world, under the Pact of Umar, Jews were treated as dhimmis. They had a cemented-in second-class status that, again, as a Jew, right, part of a wider group, you are treated separately than as a Muslim. And so there was no individualism in Islamic history for Jews. Jews were treated as Jews, right? In the Christian world, in a lot of ways, it was worse, right? There was absolutely no protections if you were a Jew. You were totally at the whim of the church and totally at the whim of whichever mayor or governor ended up ruling over your province, to some very terrible effects throughout history. And of course, I don't need to tell everybody here about medieval and late medieval anti-Semitism. In the American experiment of liberalism, for all of its flaws and for all the ways in which what I'm about to say was not true for all groups at the founding of America, obviously for women, obviously for African Americans, what I'm about to say was not true in the late 1700s, early 1800s, but at least for Jews, America started off with a premise of equality. One of the most powerful texts that I think exists in American Jewish history is, if anybody here has ever traveled to Newport, Rhode Island, I know it's the exact opposite of the country. If you get in your car and drive east for about 80 hours, right, you'll end up in Newport, Rhode Island. And there's a small synagogue, or actually a pretty medium-sized synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. And there's two fascinating things about the synagogue. Just to build a little bit of the history, the first Jews to get to America were Sephardic Jews that were kicked out of Spain and Portugal during the Inquisition. They ended up going up to the Netherlands/Amsterdam. And again, of course, knowing our American history, it was ships from both England and Amsterdam that ended up feeding in people into the New World. And there was a group of a couple of dozen Jews that got on that ship in the 1600s to come to the Americas. And so this is a very old synagogue. And two fascinating things about the synagogue. If you notice architecture on the East Coast, and especially Newport, Rhode Island, everything is very symmetrical. So if you're going to build a house, everything is symmetrical with the other houses, right? Imagine whatever HOA zoning laws you have, right? It looks like that. The Newport, Rhode Island synagogue is built at a 45-degree angle away from any other building in the city, because 45 degrees was facing Jerusalem. And this metaphor is perfect, right? As opposed to synagogues, if you go to Spain or Portugal or any synagogues in Europe that almost had to disguise themselves as regular houses, the first synagogue on American soil was built proudly at a different angle, because this was fundamentally understood by Jews from the beginning of America, that America is based on a different set of principles, a liberal set of principles that is going to treat Jews not as a class, not as a group of Jews, but as Daniel and as Scott and as Nico and as Jack. And that has been really good for Jews. The second fascinating thing about the Touro Synagogue is there's a letter from George Washington that was signed in the late 1770s, right after the Revolutionary War. This synagogue wrote to George Washington. And again, you can imagine the chaos in the first decade of the founding of America. People had no idea what it was going to be like, right? Who was George Washington? Is he going to end up taking all the power of monarchy and everything?
My spot.
Sorry, I'm going to
spot and my plate.
Hang on one second.
We're just reading somebody that was speaking. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, no, not a worry. George Washington ends up sending the synagogue a letter. And this is a famous letter for anybody who has actually listened to the musical Hamilton, which I'm going to guess is at least 75% of you. At the very end of the scene, at the very end of Hamilton, when George Washington is retiring in the musical, he quotes a verse from the Tanakh that's talking about in the Messianic days where every person will sit under their own vine and fig tree and none will be made afraid. That line is actually from a letter that George Washington writes to this Newport synagogue to say Jews are going to have equal protection in the new world. And I don't have to, again, I don't have to tell the group here that under liberalism, Jews have thrived in America. And it's not a mistake that when you look around, and one of the very difficult things about talking about anti-Semitism to non-Jews, not to Jews, but to people outside the Jewish community, is explaining the paradox of anti-Semitism, which is anti-Semitism is often based in an idea that Jews are different and Jews have too much power. And yet when you look around in America, it is true that Jews have a lot of power, and trying to explain that away. Now, everybody here understands that Jewish tradition has inculcated a spirit of both resilience and hard work in the Jewish spirit. And that is what has allowed Jews to succeed when the playing field is equalized. But this new ideology that's coming up on campus that has infiltrated the university, and especially the social sciences, especially DEI programs and everything there, is rooted on the idea that if there is not equality of outcome, somebody must be rigging the dice. And this, of course, has caused Jews to get a lot of the ire of DEI programs and a lot of groups that are using this non-liberal framework to understanding the world. They start to view Jews and the relative success that Jews have had both in America and internationally, in Israel, of course, and they say they must have done something wrong. Jews in America must have hurt some other minority group to get here. Jews in Israel must have taken somebody's land by force in order to get there. And this is when we get to just the end of my first point, the paradox of anti-Semitism in America in 2024 is that Jews are getting anti-Semitism from both sides. And the anti-Semitism on both sides is orchestrated in a way that actually cancels out protections for Jews. So just to say this a little bit more clearer, on the right, and we've seen some very scary proliferation of right-wing anti-Semitism, right? We obviously remember Charlottesville, we remember the Pittsburgh shooting, we remember the Poway shooting. All of these different acts were not left-wing anti-Semites, they were far-right anti-Semites. And far-right anti-Semitism views Jews as an inferior race. And so to somebody like Richard Spencer, a white nationalist, or Nick Fuentes, you know, one of the darlings of the alt-right, of course, to earlier right-wing anti-Semites such as Hitler, Jews were the epitome of the disgraced race, or if you're viewing it through the lens of whiteness, Jews are the least white thing possible, right? So if you're making a hierarchy of all the races according to white supremacists, whites are on the top, Jews are at the bottom. And this is, of course, one of the roots of right-wing anti-Semitism, both today and, of course, mid-20th century. On the left, with the framework they're using, where everything is about equality of outcome, they view Jews in America who have really thrived under liberalism, and they look at Jews and say, this must have only been possible because of a type of white privilege that's actually even greater than normal white privilege. And so from the left-wing point of view, from the far left-wing point of view, Jews are not just white. Jews are the epitome of whiteness, the epitome of privilege, the epitome of, again, their view that in order to get somewhere high, you had to have stepped on people under you. And these two types of anti-Semitism are squeezing Jews because Jews in some way need to be viewed as a minority with protections, because groups like the alt-right that hate minorities, Jews are right there with them. And so Jews need the protection of groups that are watchdogs in terms of racism and anti-Semitism, but yet where most Jews live, which tend to be more progressive places, right, on the coasts, in New York, on college campuses, the groups that tend to be in charge of a lot of these initiatives refuse to view Jews as a minority in need of protection, but actually view Jews as the problem. And this came to a big headway on campus this year, where there's been a proliferation of anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism. And I'll talk about that. That's my second point, is to talk about the anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism on campus. But I just wanted to give a little bit of the backdrop first. What a lot of groups on campus are saying is, don't talk to us about anti-Semitism. Half the professors in this department are Jewish. Jews make up a great percentage of the Jewish body, right? How can we be accused of anti-Semitism? Whereas for Jews, on the other side, Jews feel the anti-Semitism and also feel that nobody's listening. And so this is creating, again, a very difficult dynamic for Jews in general in more left-wing spheres, but especially on campus, where I like to argue that campus is a times 10 microcosm of everything in American life. So any opinion or any social group that might exist in a normal city, on campus, everything is times 10 in terms of the ante, because you're dealing with 18 to 22-year-olds that have left home for the first time, that are experimenting with different ideas, that aren't fully ideologically developed yet and are experimenting. And then the only people that are there to guide them are professors that have done nothing but write articles for the last 20 years in fields that are very insular without ever actually having to engage with the real world in a way. And this mixture just ends up creating radicalization. I don't mean radicalization necessarily as always a bad thing. Sometimes the radicalization has been great, right? We're all probably a fan of the Berkeley free speech movement. That was also quite radical. And so radicalization is not always bad. Sometimes the world does need something radical to shape it up. But what's happening right now is these forces are coming together to create an environment where not only are Jews under attack, but nobody will listen to the fact that Jews are under attack. Which gets me to my second point. The Jewish community, and one of the things, right, I'm going to leave people here with a little bit of a list of what can people do. I'm going to guess just looking around, right, if anyone here is engaged in campus, right, if anybody here has children or nieces or nephews or grandchildren are engaged in campus. I see one parent of a current UCI student. I won't out them publicly here. We need to do a better job at teaching our Jewish students, right, and this is true at every level, the complexities of Jewish identity. That is the way to help people understand how anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitism. The reality is Judaism and Jewish identity is an extremely difficult thing to define. The words that we use to give things definitions, religion, nationality, ethnicity, these are 18th and 19th century words that were invented by largely Protestant scholars in Europe, right? The person who invented the word religion was a Protestant scholar who probably never met a real life Jew. He only read about it in, the texts of Martin Luther, who, if you know anything about Martin Luther's views on Jews, right? He wasn't worried about, people misdefining Judaism, right? The reality is Judaism and Jewish identity is very complex. We have elements that are religious, right? We certainly have rituals. We certainly have some set of normative beliefs, even if nobody can agree on them, right? In theory, it should be possible to come up with a set of things most Jews throughout history have mostly believed. Jews also constitute mostly an ethnic group. Again, most of the way that Jewish identity shined through over the last 2,000 years was that your parents were Jewish, right? That's also complicated because now we, of course, have a lot of people who come to the community through conversion. We have a lot of people who only have one Jewish parent. But again, in general, we have a large part of Jewish identity that could be called religious. We also have a large part of Jewish identity that could be called ethnic, and we also have a national identity. When you read the weekly Torah portion every week, we're not called the religion of Israel, right? In Hebrew, it would be Dat Israel, or we don't have the ethnicity of Israel, right? There isn't even a word for ethnicity in biblical Hebrew. We're Am Yisrael, right? Am is the word for a nation, right? And so Jews have always seen their identity also as being a nation-based identity or a nationalist-based identity. And now that we have a nation state, the state of Israel, that is incorporated into Jewish identity in a way that could be quite confusing for the average Jew. And so if we can't figure out how to define Judaism, right, if we don't understand, or if more importantly, our students don't understand that calling Judaism a religion is incorrect, how are they going to explain to somebody else what constitutes hate against Jewish identity? And here's where you get to the most difficult part of this whole endeavor. And if this is something that, if I can whisper this into every Jewish student's ear in the country right now, right, I would take all the time in the world to do it. Anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitism when it affects the Jewish understanding of nationhood under the same pretenses of anti-Semitism in the past that attacked the Jews as a religious group or Jews as an ethnic group, right? This does not mean, importantly, that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. We can probably sit here, I'm going to imagine there's about 50 of us on this call right now between Zoom and in person. We can probably all come up with our own criticisms of the state of Israel, right? Maybe we'll disagree, / I'm sure we'll disagree, but I believe we all can do it. We all have something to criticize them for. Yet I would probably argue, or hope that I can argue, that nobody here is anti-Semitic, right? We all intuitively understand we can criticize settlements. We can criticize, the over-encroachment of ultra-Orthodoxy in Israel. We can criticize, how El Al operates, right? All of those things, and it does not make you an anti-Semite. It crosses into anti-Semitism when it attempts to challenge the fundamental underpinnings of our identity as a nation. So if you say that Zionism is just colonial white supremacy, that's not anti-Semitism because it's criticizing a thing about Israel. It's anti-Semitism because it is misdefining a Jewish identity, right? If somebody defines Judaism as just a religion, and a religion has no connection to the land, that is an erasure of Jewish history and Jewish identity. And one of the reasons why this is so difficult to prove in the court of public opinion is two things. One, we live in a context where the two dominant religions in the world, or in the West in the last 2,000 years, were Islam and Christianity, which are very clear-cut religions, right? I can convert to Christianity, or I can become a Muslim in the next 20 seconds. All I need to do is say something and adopt a belief, and poof, I'm a Christian, or poof, I'm a Muslim. Yet we all know it's not that easy for Jewish identity. So nobody understands this outside of the Jewish world. A lot of Jews don't even understand this. And when asked to self-define, right, I can't tell you how often I'm talking to a Jewish student and I ask you, how would you define Judaism? And they think for a moment and they say, well, it's a religion. And I said, okay, great. I'll pick up a name, right? Sam, are you religious? And Sam says, no. Sam, do you believe in God? No. Sam, are you Jewish? Yes. Sam, what is Judaism? Religion. And I'm like, Sam, does that make any sense? And he thinks about it for a second and says, no, actually, that doesn't seem to make any sense, right? And so this is something that Jews inherently don't even understand. But in order for us to be able to proactively or effectively counter this narrative that Judaism is just a religion and Zionism is this complete other thing that we can attack with full force and it has nothing to do with Jews, we have to do a better job at understanding our own identity, because if we don't understand it, how are random DEI departments or random university chancellors going to understand this when there are extremely anti-Semitic attacks that are just attacking the Jewish state? And so this is sort of the second thing. There's a confusion in general about what anti-Semitism is, and it's also causing a lack of ability to effectively fight the flow or the forces of anti-Semitism that are operating now because of the confusion that a lot of us have, and especially a lot of people who aren't very involved in Jewish life have about how to actually define us. So that is That is number two. I have two more points that I'm happy to take any and all questions. The third thing I'll say, and now I'm getting into, I'll get to the root of my pessimism, and then I'll end optimistically. About 130 years ago, a young man named Theodor Herzl, right? I'm, of course, dramatizing the story a bit. You've all heard of Herzl, right? Theodor Herzl grew up as a young, secular, assimilated atheist Jew in Western Europe. Herzl actually wrote an essay when he was in college that to solve the Jewish problem, and just a little bit of a historical reminder, there was a question that was circulating throughout the Jewish community in the 1800s that was known as the Jewish question, which is Western Europe has granted Jews equal rights, yet there is still anti-Semitism. What do we do? Right? It's a very tough question, right? This was happening in France, in England, in Germany, right? After hundreds of years of anti-Semitism, during the French Revolution, Napoleon officially grants Jews equal rights. France was the second country to do it after America. So Jews in the late 1780s are granted equality. Great. What happens the next day when you show up to work and there's still anti-Semitism, right? It's a very difficult question because now it's no longer coming from the top. Now it's coming from the bottom. And so there were a number of different answers, right? This is when you get views such as the Bundists of Jewish socialists, right? Jews joining socialism to say, well, this isn't a Jewish question. This is a financial or a materialism question. This is when you have the rise of ultra-Orthodoxy of just saying, well, we have to become increasingly insular. This is when you have the rise of the early reform movement in Germany in the 1810s and 20s. The early reform movement answer of Abraham Geiger is to say that Judaism actually is a religion, and as a religion, Judaism should attempt to become as Protestant as possible in hopes of assimilation. And sure, we can have slightly different prayers, but if Jews become the same as Germans, then nobody will hate us anymore, right? You have all these different views that the Jewish world is vying over for about 100 years. And none of them are working, right? There were countries in Europe where the reform movement won out, right? In Germany, the reform movement was dominant in the 1800s. You had other places where ultra-Orthodoxy won out, right? In places in Eastern Europe, right? Poland is a good example, right? Poland was almost all ultra-Orthodox Jews. You had other places where Jews attempted to join government and get involved and be capital L liberals and say, well, maybe it's not about helping Jews, maybe it's about pushing liberalism. And if the country becomes more liberal, then it's going to be safe for Jews, right? That was the dominant Jewish view in France and England. Herzl's growing up and he's sitting there in France in the late 1800s, and he's witnessing the Dreyfus affairs. And he sees this intense moment when in Paris, which was by all accounts, one of the most progressive countries in the world at the time, he sees Jews falsely accused, a Jewish man falsely accused of committing treason. The Jew is obviously found not guilty. This, of course, does not change the masses' opinions. And the next day in Paris, in the late 1800s, you have hordes running through the street of Paris saying, death to Jews, death to Jews. And Herzl's looking at this, and this is the inspiration for his political Zionist idea, where Herzl basically said, we've waited too long. We've trusted liberalism for too long. Liberalism has failed, right? Liberalism is a great worldview that works until it doesn't, and then things get really bad, right? Again, this is the pinnacle of pessimism. I'm going to end optimistically for everybody sitting here. And so Herzl's political Zionist manifesto, right? The Jewish Problem in the Jewish State, one of the best books that I think Jews can read, right? So if anybody hasn't read it, there are a million versions available in translation online. Herzl writes, and he says, the only way that Jews can determine our safety is we have to stop trusting any outside system. It doesn't make a difference if it's Marxism, liberalism, progressivism, religious Christianity, religious Islam, right? Atheism, right? No other ideology is going to determine Jewish safety, because Herzl understood or believed that anti-Semitism was systemic in the West in a way that even if it gets suppressed for a generation or two, it can always pop up very quickly. And again, Herzl had very interesting theories here. This isn't the place to get into a full analysis of Herzl's ideology. Fascinating to get into a full analysis, by the way. But Herzl was convinced, right? He is he was what I like to call an anti-Semitism essentialist, right? That anti-Semitism is just an essential part of the Jewish experience, at least in the West. And therefore, the only thing that Jews can do to guarantee long-term success is be in charge, right? To have a government, to have an army, to have a state with the right of return for Jews. And if Jews don't have that, we're always going to be at the whim of someone else. Now, granted, Herzl was writing this in the 1890s. This is far before the Holocaust, far before World War I even, far before what was happening to Jews in Russia, far before the expulsion of Jews from the Arab world, far before, the Soviet Union and before the Iranian Revolution, right? Everything we know about the last 120 years, Herzl was almost prophetic in his prediction. So the second thing that I want to say, and one of the messages that I've been getting across to students is we've been here before and we sort of have the playbook for how to solve this. This doesn't mean that we should all give up on America and move to Israel. I actually very much disagree with that. But we can and we should take solace in the fact that in 2024, we do have a state and we do have a country that does exist. We should be proud of that. We should also criticize it, right? The same way, right? You can be proud and criticize, something at the same time. But in a sense, the ideas of Herzl, right, highlight the fact that we are not the first generation to be dealing with a collapse of liberalism and looking around and freaking out about it. And one of the things that I've seen is a lot of Jews and this will lead into my next point nicely, a lot of Jews, and I'm seeing this on a campus level like no other. There's a view out there that is saying that more Jews than ever are becoming anti-Israel. This is purely anecdotal, what I'm about to say, so take it with a grain of salt. I am seeing the opposite, right? I'm working across 4 different college campuses in Orange County. I teach university classes at 2 of them. I meet with hundreds of students on a weekly basis. I'm meeting with dozens of professors, right? Dozens of grad students. From what I've seen, a small percentage of young Jews have become radical anti-Israelists, and the 50% of Jews in the middle who, if I would have asked them a year ago, are you connected to Israel? Do you identify as a Zionist? A year ago, they might have equivocated and they might have said, I'm not sure. America's pretty great. Why do we even need Israel? That tide has shifted. And so the last thing that I want to say, just optimistically, and then again, happy to take any and all questions about any of this, is that I think in the long term, this is going to be good for American Jewish life. That's my hottest take here. We are seeing right now a reconnection of young Jews that was impossible to predict. I'm in touch with probably 100 other Hillels across the country, right? These are the people that have their finger on the pulse of Jews from 18 to 25 more than everybody else, right? Same thing with Chabad houses that are on campus throughout the country. Every single Hillel and Chabad on campus across the country has reported at least 100% increase from the year before in terms of engagement. Our Shabbat dinners have been so big, we had to move locations multiple times throughout the year because we keep outgrowing the building we were before. On a budgetary level, it's actually bad because, you budget for a certain amount of people coming for dinner and then, 3 times that many comes, it's a blessing, but then you're also, stuck with the bill after. But, jokes aside, we are seeing a huge influx of Jews flocking to Jewish life. People that I've known for years on campus or friends of mine or just people that I met from undergrad are writing to me saying, give me book recommendations or where do I start? I want to learn about Jewish history. And long term, right, I think a lot of people are understanding that connecting to our roots, connecting to our identity, not even in a negative, right? Not as anti-Semites, right? So Jewish identity should not be defined as a bunch of people hate us, we need to fight back. Let's learn about it. But the positive aspects of our tradition, right? What are the ideas that the Jewish community has fostered over the last 2,000 years? What are some of the great thoughts, the great ideas, the great debates of Jewish history? And these are things that people are discovering now. And again, we're seeing a resurgence that, again, I'm not a demographer or sociologist, but about a couple years ago in 2020 seems like it was, 50 years ago. But in 2020, they put out the Pew report that, every liberal synagogue on the planet, right, was invested in, right? I'm sure there was some Shir Hadash meeting about the 2020 Pew report. because it reported a very difficult trend in American Jewish life, which is increased assimilation, increased people having nothing to do with Judaism, right? Orthodoxy was on the rise, and Jews who identified as Jews of no religion are on the rise, and Reform and Conservative were, plummeting. A couple years later, I don't think those results are true at all anymore. It's not to say that young Jews are identifying as either Reform or Conservative or Orthodox, right? I think a lot of Gen Z and millennials don't like to put themselves in denominational boxes. That's a question for another time. But in terms of interest in interest in Jewish life, I have never seen something like this. All the Jewish studies classes that are being taught at any university I'm connected to have had waiting lists that are greater than any other class is imaginable, and people are so interested to learn. And this was not taken for granted, by the way, right? The last thing I want to say, just to end optimistically, and then I'm going to guess there's going to be a lot of questions. I was teaching last week in my course at UCI about the Spanish Inquisition, or the lead up to the Spanish Inquisition. It started with this really terrible massacre in 1391 in Catalonia, right in the north of Spain, and then ended up spreading all throughout the Iberian Peninsula. And 101 years later, in 1492, Jews were officially kicked out of Spain. In that 100 years between 1391 and 1492, most scholars think 66, 2/3 of the Jews in the Iberian Peninsula converted to Christianity, right? Now, from a historical perspective, we can't blame them. They were given a very difficult ultimatum of, you either get expelled, tortured, right, maybe killed if you don't convert. But 2/3 of Jews decided that it would be easier to simply convert to Christianity rather than try to stick with Jewish identity. It was not taken for granted that, given the last 7 months of Jewish life, especially on campus, there would be a greater involvement. If I actually had to guess a year ago, if you told me October 7th was going to happen and then the backlash on college campuses, I would actually have predicted a shrinking away from Jewish life on campuses. But we've seen the opposite, and it's been absolutely incredible. And the students especially have stepped up in a way that I can't even imagine having done as a student. I mean, there are 18, 19, 20-year-olds that are running Jewish communities on campus like they've been doing it for 30 years, and just talking to the administration and writing op-eds and dealing with behind the scenes. And we are in for a next generation of Jewish leadership that I believe, right, we probably have to go back 2 or 3 generations to the post-Holocaust, pre-foundation of Israel Zionist movement to really find this much leadership. And so I'm just sitting here with pride at what's happening on the student level. Okay, happy to take any and all questions. I know I said a lot there.
Okay, Rabbi, we have a question that came in on the link in chat. This is from Laura. I've heard the prediction that, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I've heard that as a tail to the resurgence of interest in / desire to connect with their Jewish identity, that of Jewish community will pull back and become more insular. Parentheses, more kids sent to Jewish day schools, groups less diverse. What is your take on that?
Yeah, so thank you, Laurel, for the question. I think for better or worse, that is true as well. And I think it's also something that we have to contend with in some way. This is a really difficult, touchy subject. Just to rehash the question, what the flip side of, right, there's a really interesting theory of Jewish history, right? You can either fully accept it, fully reject it, or I have more of a middle ground opinion on this theory. The theory goes that Jewish history, at least in the last 300 years, is a dance between anti-Semitism and assimilation. And whenever one grows too much, the other one is sort of a natural check on it, right? Again, we can like the theory, we cannot like the theory, but this has been put forth by a lot of well-known Jewish sociologists. David Myers, who's actually the head of Jewish studies at UCLA. I studied with him when I was at grad school, right? He did some writing on this theory. It's a very interesting theory. So yes, I think that the natural flip side, at least for the next couple of years, is we are going to see some more insularity on behalf of the Jewish community. We are going to see more parents opt to send their kids to Jewish day school instead of public schools. We are going to see more Jews deciding to go to Brandeis as opposed to UC Santa Cruz or UC Irvine. I don't necessarily think that's the right idea, but I think it's inevitable in some way. And I can even say, I mean, this is again anecdotal, but it's, you know, a truth that I believe is true universally. The Jewish students on campus this year, they have lost touch with a lot of their non-Jewish social groups. In really sad ways. A lot of students who are, you know, again, people have complex identities, especially on campus. It's not just, right? Nobody who's going to UC Irvine or UC Santa Cruz or Berkeley or UCLA is planning on just hanging out with Jews for 4 years, right? I can guarantee you that. And so most people go and they say, well, I'm Jewish and also I'm in theater, or I'm Jewish and also I play basketball. And a lot of these other groups on campus are becoming increasingly difficult places for Jews to exist in with any type of identity. And so we are seeing an insularity that's happening on behalf of the Jewish community. Again, it's sad, but I think it's inevitable. And I think it'll also change back. I mean, again, Jewish history is very long and vast. And this is not the first time we've been at an inflection point. This is a really interesting inflection point, but I think that, you know, there'll be a couple of years of insularity and then we'll see what happens. I mean, I think it's a more interesting question, just to broaden it a little bit. I'm more certain about a positive future for Jews in America than I am for universities in America. I don't know what colleges are going to do after this year. I'm predicting, and you can quote me on this, and, you know, in August, someone can follow up with me. This summer, we're going to see the biggest changes in American university system in the last 100 years. Because every single campus team, administrators, chancellor, provost, they are going to sit together after they get through the end of this year, where graduations are being disrupted on every single campus, where the cops have been called on half the campuses in the country, and they are getting together and they are saying, what the heck are we going to do if we have another year of this? No one's coming to college. And maybe if they come to college, right, maybe they'll come to study computer science. No one's coming to get a degree in, you know, history anymore. And that's a problem for the university. I don't know if you want me to call out. Yeah, go for it.
He put it in the chat. Daniel, do you mind if I ask you one while we're figuring out this chat one?
Please.
By the way, I want to point out that Daniel talks to, I don't think there are many people you could talk to who have so many direct puts from so many students in America. I really, really want to put that out there. But I also talk to some people here and there, and I want to challenge you on this anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism thing you've said. And I'll give you sort of the combined view of a few of the students I've spoken to who will say something like, I have, you know, an entire Jewish background. It's a key component of my identity. I have a great love of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, right? I have frankly, an argumentative relationship, but a deep relationship with Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. I have an incredible kavod for, a incredible sense of respect for Yiddishkeit, I don't know how to translate Yiddishkeit, for Yiddishkeit. But like, you want me to back this country in the Middle East making horrible decisions to a hilt? Get out of town. And
yeah,
you say that's anti-Semitic?
No. So here's the problem. And the anti-Israel ideological crowd we sort of shot ourselves in the foot, and we're sort of reaping the fruits of shooting ourselves in the foot. If you read the PLO charter in 1964, right, I'll just go into some history. They actually quote a series of liberal American rabbis from the 1800s saying that Judaism is a religion and has no ties to the land of Israel, right, in the Pittsburgh platform, right? The Reform movement has moved on, right? In the 30s, they reneged it, but the PLO charter is based off of the Pittsburgh platform in their understanding of Jewish identity, just to give some interesting insider Jewish history baseball. And so this is something that even a lot of American Jews don't intuitively understand. It doesn't mean that all American Jews have to support Israel or even be Zionists, right? You can be a non-Zionist or even be against the state of Israel, right? You can think it's a bad idea, right? I talk to students all the time, right? Let's take the two easy examples, right? Nobody here would argue that a Satmar Jew is an anti-Semite, right? We might argue that they're living in the 1800s and they have, that they're wrong, right? I certainly think they're wrong. But Satmar Jews, just to give a little bit of background, it's the largest Hasidic group in the world. There's estimated to be about 700,000 of them, and they are associated with, extreme anti-Zionism, right? Yoel Teitelbaum, the Satmar Rebbe that lived in the 1930s and 40s, wrote an infamous essay, right? I'll give a little bit of a trigger warning before I say this. He blames the Holocaust on the Zionist movement, just to get a sense of how anti-Zionist and extreme they are. So there's a modern ideology, right? It mostly exists in New York, right? That is that anti-Zionist. I think they're wrong, but they're not anti-Semitic, right? Clearly they have just a different theological approach that, again, incorrect, but not anti-Semitic. You can also be, right? There was a lot of people that might be what's called in history a diasporic nationalist, right? And that's the view of saying for long-term Jewish safety, Jews are actually safer in the long term in America than they would be in the state of Israel, right? Again, I don't think that view's correct, but it's not anti-Semitic. The problem is what's being conflated now, and a lot of young Jews that are joining anti-Israel movements, they themselves aren't doing a good enough job at parsing it. Saying those things in a well-reasoned account, even if that's mixed in with very harsh criticism of Israel, criticism I would disagree with. If somebody says that Israel is committing war crimes left and right in Gaza right now, I don't think that's inherently anti-Semitic. I don't think it's true, right? If we were arguing military politics, I would push back. But if somebody told that to me, my first thought is not, this anti-Semite. It's, this person doesn't really understand what it means to have military, war in an urban area, right? Maybe we can discuss it. The problem is now with the most extreme cases, if somebody tells me Zionism is only based off of Jews learning from what Hitler did to us and us doing that to Palestinians, a view that I encounter on campus every single day, or that Jews have just taken, some mixture of white supremacy and colonialism and just pushed that into the Middle East, that is anti-Semitism in a way that even if you're an anti-Zionist, you should be able to call out. So it's not that anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. It's that there is a lot of anti-Semitism mixed in within a lot of anti-Zionists because it's very convenient. Some of it is conscious, some of it is unconscious, right? I believe that most sexism and racism and anti-Semitism, at least in the West in 2020, a lot of it is unconscious, right? We don't realize we're doing it. That's the whole point of more liberal and progressive trainings, of saying, well, here are some things you should, pay attention to of different people's history and lived experience. I don't know what it's like to be a woman in America in 2024. And so if I never asked, a woman what constitutes hate or sexism, I would have no idea. And I would get a lot of things wrong. And I should rightly so be educated on that. And that's called, normal learning about the world. So what's happening with anti-Zionism now is that that's not happening. And I actually place a lot of blame on Jews who are anti-Zionist, right? That's fine, but they need to do a better job calling out anti-Semitism within their own camps, but they're afraid to do that, right? That's where it gets scary, is that there's no pushback allowed in these internal groups. And so you have to be sitting there, if you're in one of these encampments, you can't say, hey, the sign that says Zionism equals racism equals Nazism, hey, can we probably take that down, right? You would be kicked out. And so I would push back on those Jewish students. And I would say that they're being either they're being misled, or I think they are just, they themselves are actually scared, right? I think a lot of young Jews are torn, right? It's a really difficult situation to be in, to be a young progressive Jew. A lot of these people also have intersectional identities. So, a young progressive, LGBT Jew who has spent their whole life existing in more progressive bubbles. And all of a sudden, all of your friends are unanimously agreeing Zionism is the worst thing to ever happen in the last 70 years of the world. I don't blame them for joining to some extent, right? Again, I don't think they're right. But once they're in there, you have to try to affect change from within. And it's the same reason why, right? I'll just give a counterexample, Rev. Michael, and happy to take other questions. Jews who are Republican, right? Conservative Jews, right? They do exist, I promise. Right? Republican Jews, I want them to also spend a lot of time talking about anti-Semitism on the right, because it's much easier to call out anti-Semitism as a political spade, right? If I know I'm going to vote Democrat in the next election, it's very easy for me to rant about Trump's, tacit support of Charlottesville, whether or not you agree it was, right? I don't mean to go spin off politics, but it's very easy for me to rant about right-wing anti-Semitism, the Marjorie Taylor Greene Jewish space laser, right? We can all have a laugh and haha. It's a lot harder for me to say, hey, what's happening in the Democratic Party, and vice versa. And so if you're not calling out anti-Semitism from within your own ideology, then I will challenge your care about Am Yisrael, because then you're just doing it to fit in a way. Vardan, I know that you had a question. I didn't want to. I saw your hand up.
Oh yeah, I'm just typing it out to Jack.
Oh,
Yes.
sure.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question. How
Yes,
do
I don't know
you
how are we doing the question thing? Do you want to be in charge, or do you want me to be in charge?
I'm gonna ask my questions. That's how we're gonna do it.
Can you hear?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
How do you engage with a Jewish student that has pretty much bought into the Palestinian / Hamas narrative and strongly believes that Israel is committing genocide and all the other things that you mentioned, that Israel is there just to do to the Palestinians what was done to us, et cetera, et cetera. How do you engage? How do you even start a conversation?
It's a great question. I would say it depends on whether or not they want to engage. A lot of Jewish students that are in those groups really don't want to engage, which I think is really sad. And so if they don't want to engage, I don't feel the need to chase them down. I know that sounds harsh, but there are so many Jewish students on campus that need help and need support and want to learn and are actively seeking out. And there's, everything has an opportunity cost. And so I'm not going to chase after a student if I start seeing them posting, terrible things. Maybe I'll send them one text, hey, it seems like you're conflicted about this, I'm always around to grab coffee, but I won't chase them down. If they're open to conversation, then again, it really depends on their, on generally, at least what I found, and this is true, I think, talking to anybody with an extreme anti-Israel ideology, it's based on some misunderstanding, right? So either a misunderstanding of Jewish history, Jewish identity, what the point of Zionism was, or anything like that. And so hoping that, again, most of the time you can't, it's very hard to change somebody's mind with one or two conversations, but the goal, I think, of good education is to leave people even a little bit more conflicted than they came in, right? There was a famous Hasidic rabbi that said that the goal of a rabbi, right? I'll now use this as an interpose to the role of a good educator, is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comforted, right? If somebody's afflicted, if somebody's suffering, right? My job as a rabbi is to provide them comfort, right? No judgment, right? If somebody in the community is sick or needs something, I'm not asking about their politics, right? Of course. And if someone is too comfortable, right? If somebody thinks they know everything and know the truth and, right, they are correct on everything, right? I want to push them a little bit, right? Not afflict them literally, but, provide some nuance. And I think that really is the key to talking with any student who I think is too comfortable in their own views, is trying to push them a little bit of saying, might you be wrong about this? Might you be wrong about that? And I'm very honest with students. There are a lot of things that I'm conflicted about. I mean, and I think that's helpful for them to know. I think a lot of times both rabbis and professors, right? A lot of times I'm both, right? There's just this assumption that they know everything, right? Rabbis don't know everything. Professors don't know everything, right? half the time we're also just making stuff up as we go along. I mean, obviously with more of a educational underpinning, right? Obviously Rabbi Nico and Rabbi Michael, right? They know everything, but I don't know everything. And so, and telling students that I think is really powerful. I told a student the other day, we were talking, a student came to me, she wasn't the, Israel is Nazi, but she came and said, listen, I'm really troubled by what's seemingly about to happen in Rafah. It seems like it's terrible. And I told her, and I'm like, listen, I've read everything I can about the military situation in Gaza. I told her, listen, I'm also conflicted. I don't know from a long-term strategy point of view if this is a good idea for Israel or not. I've read everything I could on the subject, right? And she was like, wait, really? And I was like, yeah, it's a really, right? Here are all the reasons why Israel should invade Rafah, right? We can come up with them now. Here are all the reasons why it could be a disaster. I don't know. There's good there's good things on both sides. And that made her feel much better. Not because she came away with the answer, but she observed that being conflicted is actually an okay state, right? It's okay for our answer to be, we don't know, as opposed to trying to pretend that we know everything. But I don't think that sells well in the modern day, right? It's very hard, right? If I want to get 100,000 followers on social media, which I don't necessarily want to, it's going to be a lot harder for me to do that, talking about how everything is very complicated, than if I become a champion for one view and just push it through, because who wants to deal with complexity? And it's the same in class, right? It's a lot easier to design a course. If I present one view, it's a lot harder to present other views, because then you got to read more papers, and then you got to, read people you disagree with and present them, in the strongest light possible. And so that has been always the way that I've engage with students, especially now, because I think students deserve it. And I think, again, the contrast of that with the fundamentalism of the anti-Israel side that we're seeing on campus, they don't want to engage. For them, it's very simple. This is black and white. Israel is bad. Palestinians are good. They don't want to have any nuanced conversation. And so if you go to someone on the quote unquote other side, and that person says, listen, there are things I know, right? I do know that Jews have a historic connection to the land of Israel, right? It's not that I don't know anything, but I don't know what Israel should do militarily. Do you prioritize the hostages? Do you prioritize wiping out Hamas? Do you prioritize making sure the US doesn't, start pulling away aid from Israel, right? These are all very real things to consider. And that actually helps a lot of students.
Thank you.
Okay. Daniel, you have a question in your messages, and I think we have a question right here.
Which one do you want to go to first?
You first.
Hi.
Daniel might need to.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Hi, my name is Alon. Thank you, Rabbi Levine. I and my fiance, Ariel, we are part of that resurgence of reconnecting with our Jewish community that you correctly referenced earlier as a result of, the tragedy of October 7th. I agree with just about everything that you've said this evening. I want to make some comments, and then I have a question. I agree with your claim that a lot of the anti-Zionism that we've been seeing and hearing is just anti-Semitism masquerading as anti-Zionism. It's totally valid to criticize a country, Israel or any other, for its policies, for its military strategies, for its tactics. But when we hear things like globalize the Intifada, when we hear things like from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free, if they even just changed the word Palestine to Palestinians, if they were to say Palestinians should be free, it would be a little more palatable for me to get behind that. And I think they should be free of Hamas and other authoritarian Islamist, jihadist organizations, just as much as they should be free of so-called alleged apartheid. But when they call Israel an illegitimate white settler colonialist project of the Europeans and the Americans, they're really dabbling in racism, and it's really low-hanging fruit, because at that point, they're not making legitimate criticisms of a country's policies or legitimate criticisms of a military strategies or tactics. They are questioning the very legitimacy of the existence of a nation state, and they are exposing their hypocrisy because with all their wokeism, they claim to be on the side of the oppressed and against the oppressor, and they very wholeheartedly embrace the causes of many indigenous peoples struggling for a right to return or repatriation. And then here we see this project of Zionism, which is not a settler colonialist project because no empire sponsored this colony. It's not a project of imperialism. It's literally a national project to have a Jewish home. Now, there are many who say that they are not comfortable with the idea of an ethno-state, right? They don't like the fact that Israel is a so-called ethno-state. It's a Jewish state. And yet we have de facto ethno-states everywhere. We have de facto Christian or Catholic states. We have de facto Muslim states. I would not be welcome in the city of Mecca or in the city of Medina, and yet Muslims from around the world are welcome in Jerusalem. So again, there's hypocrisy. It's a double standard. So to my question, we're outnumbered. What do we do to leverage whatever support we can get in this optics war, in this PR war? I find myself very depressed and very dismayed that it seems like nowadays the only allies I can find are on Fox News or Sky News Australia or Breitbart, people I would have considered political opponents to my, because I'm a liberal. But I don't see liberalism in what these so-called progressive college students are marching for. And it's we're outnumbered. The other Arab countries will give no quarter to the Palestinians and will treat them as second or third class citizens. An Arab Israeli or Palestinian has more rights and more opportunities in Israel than they have in any Arab country on earth. But they will be very quick to use the Palestinians as pawns for their political aims of delegitimizing Israel. And they have a lot of, forgive my language, they have a lot of useful idiots to manipulate amongst all the Western, the European and American college campuses. And so we're outnumbered, I think 100 to 1. The question is, what can we do to try to change the narrative here?
Yeah, it's a great question. So 3 things. I was just taking some notes when you were talking. We need to be better at making, I mean, not we in this call, but societally, we need to distinguish liberals and progressives. I think for a while, progressives were just liberals that were a little bit more left-wing. But now it is 2 completely different mindsets when someone says they're a liberal and someone says they're a progressive. And even if oftentimes they end up advocating for the same thing, right? Let's take an easy case study. Liberals and progressives agree about abortion, right? So you might think liberals and progressives are generally the same because they have the same views on abortion. But the entire underpinning structure of what a liberal wants is different than a progressive, right? Liberals want individualism, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of and from religion, all these things. Progressives, especially, this new round of progressives, they are focused on equity, which again, it's not saying equity is always good or always bad, right? I'm not moralizing, but it's just the set of raw materials that you need to put in place to ensure that my company has an equal mixture of every ethnicity and every gender are going to be different raw materials than if you want the company to be every single person is treated as an individual, right? That's something that I think is intuitive, right? We intuitively understand that with a lot of things, but these 2 groups and ideologies are clashing in major ways. Again, there are some times where we might say the progressive view makes more sense, and other times where we might say the liberal view, or other times maybe a conservative view, but they're not the same thing. And I think Jews are starting to realize that. And inside the Democrat, I mean, one of the most interesting things that's happening now, this just happened in California, right? Adam Schiff won the Senate primary. and he was running against, right, Katie Porter, who's much more of a progressive, right? Adam Schiff is much more of a classical liberal. Whatever people think politically here aside, that is a microcosm of what's happening in a lot of other races where progressivism seemingly is being defeated by liberalism because a lot of people are realizing this and they don't want identity to be front and center in a lot of these things. And so this is a really interesting battle to watch for the next couple of years. The second thing is, interestingly enough, this is also something I like to tell students, Israel actually has less haters now than at any other time in history. It sounds weird to say, but the entire backdrop to what's happening, the most significant event for Middle East history that happened in the last 10 months was Jordan and Saudi Arabia shooting down the Iranian ballistic missiles, right? It almost didn't, I mean, it was a big news story for the weekend, but in the Jewish community, it kind of came and went because nothing really happened of it. Saudi Arabia is the largest and wealthiest, Arab state in the world. This is where Mecca and Medina are. This is the cultural and religious center of the Sunni Islamic world, which 90+% of Muslims are Sunni. Everybody looks to Saudi Arabia for what to do. And because of the Abraham Accords, because of, again, globalism in a lot of ways, the trend in the Middle East is now, it's much less the Israeli-Arab conflict, it's the Iranian, anti-Iranian conflict. Israel is an interesting proxy because Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis are obviously funded by Iran. There's a lot of theories as to why this year on October 7th, one of the most interesting theories is that this was a Hamas attempt to overthrow the Abraham Accords. They almost succeeded, but I mean, politically, I think Iran overplayed their hand by shooting missiles. I think that was a bad move, but that's, political commentary on the side. But once you have Saudi Arabia and Jordan shooting down missiles in the Middle East right now, you actually don't see widespread anti-Israel protests, right? It's really interesting, right? Obviously, I'm not saying that if you took a flight to Egypt right now, everybody would be cheering on Israel in the war. Of course not. But the average, person right now in the Middle East, and especially the average leader in the Middle East, is actually viewing the situation as much more complex than your average anti-Israel college kid, which should either really worry us about college kids or really excite us about the optimism of the future in really exciting ways, right? Like Israel in some way has succeeded in some sense in being treated as a normal country in the Middle East, which is a big deal. So that's the other thing I'll say. The third thing is I think you're right. And the problem with, I actually don't think, this is my more pessimistic outlook, but it's where I agree with Herzl. I don't know if it's possible to convince the wider non-Jewish public that to understand and care about anti-Semitism. I mean, that's just always sort of been my pessimistic view. A lot of people disagree with me about it. So don't, if anyone wants to push back, feel free. I don't have this view, emotionally. I just intellectually, I just think Herzl was right. I think, and one of the questions that somebody wrote to me in the chat was why is there so much anti-Semitism? I think it's, for 2,000 years, Jews have been a minority that survived, which first of all is incredible, right? No other minority group that lost their homeland 2,000 years ago survived, right? There were many groups that were like Jews. They're just, maybe a footnote in history right now. We somehow are still here, right? Incredible. But we have been a minority under either the Christian world or the Islamic world for the last 200 years, where we were defined as the other. In the medieval period, in both Christendom and the Islamic world, there were only two groups. In the Christian world, it was Christians and Jews, and in the Islamic world, it was Muslims and Jews. The Muslims and Christians were too busy fighting each other, and so Jews were the minority in both of those places. Jews were spread out. Jews had no power. Jews were forced to be the money handlers and the businessmen, because if you're in France, which is Christian, and you want to trade with Portugal, which is Muslim, you don't trust each other because the Christians and Muslims hated each other. And so you just have the Jews do it. There are Jews in Portugal. There are Jews in France. Let's just have the Jews do it, right? Jews trust each other inherently. They can travel back and forth safely. And if the Jews try to cheat us in business, we'll just kill them because they have no power anyway. I mean, I'm being a little facetious, but that is generally what life was like for about 700 years for Jews in the Middle Ages. And so the entire self-definition of Jews was defined as us being the powerless minority, right? Like in the understanding, and there are a lot of theological texts to back this up, right? Starting with the 4th century with Augustine, medieval thinkers, medieval Islamic thinkers, their view as to why they knew their religion was true was because they were powerful and Jews were not powerful, right? It's why the Crusades excited such a fervor throughout the Christian world. If you're able to retake the Middle East, it means God is with you. If Salah ad-Din, right, in the 13th century takes back, the Middle East, it means God is with them. The Jews, of course, God's not with them. Look at them, right? They're pitiful, right? They're a minority, right? And right, this is something that everybody was writing about. If we read medieval writings, even Jews were writing about this, right? One of the most famous Jewish philosophic works was a book about was Judah Halevi's Kuzari, and he wrote, the title of the book was A Defense of the Despised Faith, because he recognized Jews were always treated as a minority. And I think that kind of stuck. I mean, I think in the Western mind, and it's seeped into culture, you can see it in even Shakespeare and Chaucer, and you're right, all that Jews are just supposed to be the minority, right? Like, we are not seen as people that are supposed to have power, right? Something is wrong in the Western world. I say all that just to say, I don't know if we're ever going to be able to change that tide. I mean, this is so baked into the West and to the Christian worldview and Islamic worldview, not every Christian or every Muslim, of course, but if we truly understand the theology, I mean, just one example, and then I'll move on. I tend to go on a tangent, right? We all, everybody here, I'm assuming, has some familiarity with the Torah, right? Imagine if there was an ethnic group, right? The Amalekites, who the Torah is not very fond of, right? The Torah commands the Israelites to wipe them out. A lot of stories in the Tanakh are about waging war against Amalek. Imagine if they survived till modern day and there was a small group of them living in the land of Israel. Of course they'd be treated bad, right? Like, you have all these texts talking about how terrible these people are. Even if there were liberal Israelis, right, just in this thought experiment saying, treat the Amalekites well, if every week at synagogue we're reading about destroying the Amalekites, it doesn't take a genius to figure that out, right? The reality is, in the New Testament, in the Quran, in the Hadiths, in church fathers, it talks about Jews as being evil. I mean, again, there are some very good efforts in both the Christian and, starting in the Muslim world to start to undo that. Just like, again, there are a lot of parallels to draw, but I don't know if that's going away. So yes, not the most optimistic answer, but I've given up on convincing. I see there's another question in the chat. It's a little...
You asked partially what Radon was asking, which is, and he had a lot of points to his questions. We've got a question locally, if you would ask it.
Yeah, I have two. Sorry, I have two kids going to college for the first time next year in the fall. So it seems like to me a lot of the dialogue around this situation is very simplified, especially in college campuses, which is part of the problem. There's a complexity there that is not being talked about, like the whole idea of Iran really being in charge of these different groups, and the fact that this is a Sunni Shiite type of dichotomy going on, and just a lot of other things that just got swept under the rug and aren't discussed in our political system or in any language in any of these places. How can I have a conversation that broadens my children's view that tends to be narrowed by the way that it's talked about in education?
It's a great question. Maybe this might be too personal of a follow-up, but if they're interested, I still think there's no substitute for books. I'm sort of a little bit old school. Even podcasts and YouTube videos, I don't think get the same amount of engagement as books that you really have to take your time with, and you can't get bored fast forward ×2 speed, and you can't really zone out, because if you do, you'll have to go back and read it. I don't think there's any shortcut to knowledge. I mean, I think it's a big, even separate than this, with a lot of college students today, especially now that they all have ChatGPT, it's a big problem. I mean, a third of the papers that I get, I run through AI detectors, and they've been written with AI. I mean, I honestly don't know what to do, right? Here's another admission of not knowing what to do. I don't know what to do, because you can't fail a third of the people. I mean, maybe you can, you should, but I think people are so used to, instant knowledge, but I think that people have to be convinced that that's not the way to acquire a true understanding of anything. And so there are a lot of really good books that present different opinions about Jewish history and Israel history and Zionism. And I think making that an intellectual project could be really exciting. And then the other thing is just a healthy dose of skepticism. I mean, not cynicism, but just anytime anybody presents you with an opinion, even me, right, take a step back and say, who is this person? What are they trying to convince me of? What are their biases? Do they have good points? What would somebody that's contradicting their point say? And I think if somebody approaches the world with that framework, it's just going to be, it'll just be helpful, because then anything, right, they'll realize that anytime they're presented with something, there's some, attempted bias there. It's a scary time to be going, right? I don't want to sugarcoat it. It is definitely a scary time to be sending 2 kids to college. It's also an exciting time because, again, Jewish communities have grown and are revamped. I can say just on the separate, off the record side, even though this is being recorded, I mean, our donations have increased, right? A lot of people are worried. And so a lot of people want to donate to, Hillels and universities. And so there's a lot more fellowships that have been created nationally by Jewish campus organizations. And so it is a really exciting time to be involved in college also, because unlike, some 4 years, 20 years ago where, I'm sure something exciting was happening on campus 20 years ago, but, they are quite literally going to be a part of history here in a way that I can't guess what it's going to be like in 2 years. And I think that's really exciting. It's also nerve-wracking, but I don't know if that's helpful. If you tell me if you want to message me offline, I'm happy to, Rabbi Michael has all my contact info. I'm happy to connect them if I know the Hillel people there.
Thank you.
Daniel, can you share, if we could send this out, but your blog or your podcast or anything that we could do to stay in touch with the information you're putting out in the world?
Sure. I sometimes put out videos on a YouTube channel that I created last year when I realized I started doing a lot of Zoom classes. You are all more than welcome to engage with it. I also am more than happy to leave my information here, and I'm really more than happy to continue the conversation with anybody. This is something that I am very passionate about, Judaism in general, but obviously the current moment and campus life. And so I am more than happy to be helpful if anybody has themselves or kids or, nieces, nephews, grandkids, or anything like that, being enrolled in college now. If anybody is really, this will be just the last pitch that I'll make, is that if anybody is interested in, you sort of all now, after sitting here for an hour, know my educational style in some way. I did attend my class at UCI, which is an overview of Jewish history class. I recorded an online version. It's on this YouTube, but I just put the website. Lived on.
No idea what.
So I put the link to that in there. If anybody is interested in just an overview of Jewish history, I think it is really helpful because you see the same themes happen over and over again, which one is just interesting, but also I think just helpful to contextualize, where we're at now.
Podcast?
Yes. The podcast sometimes has similar things to the YouTube, but sometimes there's something also. This is Spotify.
Somehow managed to interview people. I think he's interviewed former prime ministers of Israel on his podcast. He's done some really incredible work. So thank you for sharing that, Rabbi Daniel, and we can copy the links here.
I think I'll copy the links and I'll have them available if anybody wants it. You can just contact me, let me know. Contact the men's club somehow. Yeah, I can do that. Yeah. Copy it all. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you.
So,
Here.
Steve
Talk
again.
into that.
I want to thank you very much for a very informative session. I think you've opened the gates for some people to seek more information and do more reading and become more educated. And I have two granddaughters that will be entering college next year, and I hope that I'll be able to maybe guide them to do a little bit of reading. It's very hard to get anyone to do any reading nowadays. They like to be spoon-fed, preferably by some kind of a video, and so maybe they'd be interested in your podcasts and videos. But I really appreciate the opportunity to learn from you and to get your experiences. You're right in the front lines of some of the issues, some of the activity that's going on campuses right now. And I certainly do appreciate, again, the opportunity to have learned from you and shared with you. I don't know if anyone else has anything more to say, but we thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all for having me. So it's always wonderful to do, anything and everything with Shir Hadash.
I'll contact you directly. We have some business to finish up. So I'll send
thank
you a
you.
note.
And feel free to stay in touch. You have my email there. Also send it out, and anyone who has it is welcome to share it with whoever. And thank you everyone for caring. I mean, I think the last thing I'll say is the Jewish students are very hopeful when they realize that they have an entire wider Jewish community behind them, because it's not always obvious on campus. And so they're always very happy when I, can report back that there are a lot of people that are thinking about them and, worried about them. It gives them strength.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'll end it.